As we as a group who were this morning in Old Goa, I'm very happy to speak about Old Rome, because we are speaking here, we'll present here to you ruins and their history. And so I think it's a good day for me to have both sides, Goa and Rome, again at the same time. What I've decided to present to you is not the story of Rome that you may know, the story of their major monuments that are known, but I decided to pose some questions. So how some monuments are still with us from ancient Rome, and why some have been destroyed? What are the general laws, if there are any, that can give us monuments and can give us only documents? And from these questions, I'll bring you first in some notes just to remind you the long history of the city, that it began in the 7th century before Christ, and it had a monument, a very important monument on 5th century, when the Roman Empire collapsed and the city was in a crisis. That is, the city was no more the capital of an empire, so that it lost its population, it lost its richness, it lost almost all. And then from that time onwards, it was a long story of difficulties, of long story of hard life. That is what you know very well is the medieval centuries, that in Rome especially began in the 7th century till arrived very late in Europe. This is the 13th century, just because the seat of the Pope was then in Rome, but for some century it was brought in France. And so only in the year 1308, the seat of the Pope became again Rome. That's because the long medieval history of the city, it has so many centuries of anarchy, of one against the other, of unsafety of the city, of ruins, of anyone was as taking care of the city. And then in the year 1308, all began again. And I will stop my presentation on about the 15th century. That is the first year of the Renaissance that all of you know. That is the beginning of a new era, the new beginning of a new attention to ancient monuments. So I would try to pose my questions: what survived and what not, and what has been destroyed along these dark centuries. We have documents, but we don't have many of them. That is, in medieval Europe we have text, and we don't have drawings. We have first drawings and pictures of the city, of landscape drawings, only about from 15th and 16th century. So that I'm not going to present you a history on documents, on Latin documents, but I'll present a history of the survival of the monuments from the first drawings, the first picture of those monuments. So these are our first images of Rome. Some of them are bird's eye view, some of them they came from on your right. Some of them came from frescoes, from paintings. And what you can understand, just having a look on them, there are some emergencies. That is, there is a city of small buildings, small houses, a city where there are some major buildings, and those are not only churches, but are something that has that came from the past, that are the older monuments that have been preserved. So that what we can say now, just for the first thing that we can affirm, is that there's a group of monuments survived, and this is the group that we see in a picture in the 15th century onwards, and is the same group that we still have today. So we have a look on what exactly remained. This is a famous Rome bird view, and is it called bird view? You use the term bird view. Just pardon?
Bird's eye.
Yes, bird's eye view. Excuse me, it's not bird's eye view, and this is an engraving that was very popular in around the end of the 15th century, where you can have a look on what is important is the St. Peter's here. All this is the new central part of medieval Rome, that is the seat of the Pope, the Basilica, where was built in the 4th century and was rebuilt and built again. And this is a part that is presented in front of you. But I would like to point some other places here. That is the walls of the city. The walls survived. The walls were Roman walls that were kept in order because walls were useful. In a medieval city, you have to defend yourself from enemies, so that what was useful was kept in function. And here you have a look on the walls. And secondary, there are some great temples that survived. One of the famous is the Pantheon in Rome, and if you look at the general bird's eye view, you can detect where the Pantheon is. And here's a view at Pantheon of a little later, but you can have a look on how big is the Roman building and how small are the houses nearby. And what else had survived are columns, honorary monuments, arches. Here you have a look on one of the columns, 2 of them survived, and here is another view of the building. And again, you can have a look on what's the difference from the houses, medieval houses, and Roman monuments. And other elements very important in the identity of Rome are some statues. I'll point on one of them. You can have a look on horses and warriors bringing them, and then I'll show you. I'm speaking of those famous group of horses that came from Greece, and warriors, and they are still extant in Rome now. And I would point also on the fact that Roman architecture made major huge buildings, also as a civil architecture, not only temples, not honorary arches, statues and architecture, but there was a sort of architecture of entertainment, that is theaters, that is amphitheaters, and there were circuses. There were huge structures that hosted hundreds of people, sometimes thousands of them, with general show that were paid by the emperor. There was a sort of some special festivities where the emperor paid for the general shows or kind of entertainment. And these were the huge building made in concrete, made not in marble, were not temples, but they were very huge, and you have to remember, very difficult to destroy. It's very difficult to destroy a huge mass of bricks, and it's very difficult that this great building can disappear without leaving traces. Look at here is a theater, and from the general picture you can have an idea of the rounded walls, and this is the structure. And the most famous, I think all of you know, is the Colosseum in Rome, that is presented here on the far left, and it's a round structure that had as show inside. So there were different type of buildings that I've showed you: temples, honorary architecture, and civil buildings, that all of them had a long story during the medieval times. So what I would like to point to my presentation is to focus on 3 of them, just to have different stories, just to compare the stories of survival, just to present you a type, a sort of different ways of survival. One thing is necessary to say at first, that the Rome around the walls is a bigger Rome than the medieval city. That is, Rome in ancient time had millions of inhabitants, and the inhabitants had water that arrived from the aqueducts that were coming from the hills and the mountains next to the city, bringing water to the public necessities, to the fountains, to the baths. And Rome was ancient Rome was a city rich of waters. And what happened in the 5th century is that the aqueducts were cut, and there was not any possibility to have the water aqueducts again, so that all the population shrunk and became to live next to the river, and their life was depending on the river water, so that the bigger Rome was a small Rome next to St. Peter, and in the central part of the city, just around a place that is, here is the St. Peter's, and you can have a look on the river here, and you have to think that old Rome is this one. So the medieval city is around the water, because also the bridges fell down, and the only bridge was surviving is this on the easiest way to pass the river, that is where the island was. So that you have to think about a city, a smaller city, and I would like to point on this area just to have the story of some of those buildings, because they were the buildings in existence where the life never left, where the city was always continuing. Because other parts where, for instance, the Colosseum it's here, the monuments can survive because the city was abandoned. So there were fields where agricultural use of all the mansions, and all survived very well because no one used it. But I would like to point on this place, that is where the life always was still going on. And here is a plan of the 18th century, when you can have a look on the texture of the medieval city, and here I've pointed on the orange color those 3 places, and where I would like to speak about, and here they are in this area that I've showed you before. So one is a temple, it's here. One is a circus, and it's here. And the third one is a theater, or what it's still extant. First, we have to think about temples. Temples had not survived very well because you know that from Constantine, the emperor, the church had gained its relevance in Roman Empire, so that temples before the 4th century were all closed. So temples were being destroyed by the loss of maintenance and by the need to obtain precious materials like marble, and moreover the iron iron what that was inside the marble slabs, and iron was very important in medieval times because the mines were too far away from Rome, and so as the city was obliged to live on herself, they lived on her ruins, and so many monuments lost their shape, and because the people went to look for first from iron, and then when the temple collapsed for marble. And so that you can have a look on what the temples were like, destroying it piece by piece, and when the piece fell down, it was used as a slab or whatever. And you can have a look also on inside of the churches. This is the St. John's Lateran, one of the first basilicas, and you can have a look on the capitals, all different. That signifies that that capital came from temples. So there were temples were dismantled piece by piece, and churches were built on their best materials. And moreover, also also private houses could show pieces of temples, the columns, the capitals, and entablatures. You can have a look here. And my story is a story of survival, and Pantheon survived almost entirely, just because it was converted in church. Because at the edict of the end of 378 ordered that all temples had to be closed. But in 608, after centuries then, when the Christian religion was well set and the pagan were away, the church accepted to convert a temple in a church. First, because the Pantheon is another, the form of Pantheon is not like temple-like, because it's a space, a round space with a dome. So this was, as Pantheon was something different at first, when first was built in 2nd century, then it was easier to convert it in a church. So it was converted here, and now it's still well kept. It's the only building all over the Roman world that can, where you can get inside and have a look on the original marbles, because inside all buildings of ancient Rome, Roman marbles are lost. So if you want to have a look on what the Roman architecture was like inside a monument, you have to get inside the monument, the Pantheon. But I would like also to show by my pictures, they are from, I told you they are from 15th century and 16th century, that some damages are still, that you can say that they survive, but not entirely. Because if you have a look on this picture, you can understand that having all those houses next to the temple, some part had lost their shape, some columns were missing, and so the Pantheon arrived till our times, but was was restored in his lost part in 19th century. So you can have a look also in the bell tower that was built over, just to show that there was a church. And I would like also to point an important issue on my presentation, that the modern city after medieval times was 5-6 meters higher, because the ruins, because the building crumbling, and so and to get inside Pantheon, once it was built, you had to climb the stairs, some stairs, and in medieval times and afterwards you have to descend some stairs, because the Roman soil, ancient Roman soil, is 5-6 meters below the modern level. So that you have to think how many destruction, how much material is now on the soil, and all this part is the loss of the city at the end. Here is an image that can show you what I was telling you. That is the modern city, And under the green line, you can have a look on what was in ancient times, so that you can have an idea of what survived. And if you are going to Rome now, what you're looking at is something that restorer did in 19th century. From 19th century outward, they tried to around some of the biggest monuments, they tried to have the level as in Roman times. And I would like to point also, one is this history, the survival of a temple because it was a church, and the other issue is what to do of what is totally useless. Civil architecture was built to a kind of life totally lost, because in Christian times there were these theaters, in mass theater show, there were not fighting and wars and beasts and what was going on in ancient Rome. So what to do with those useless buildings? And the story goes on with some notes that we can have, that is, for example, a theater. It's a huge structure. And in medieval times was best way to use a structure so big is to make it a fortress, because you have factions one against the other, so every big building, every big structure became a castle, a fortress, one family against the other with towers on it. So you have to think that the first century of survival of those big monuments were as fortresses. But the story goes on, because here is the image I told you is from the 16th, 15th century onwards. This is an engraving of the first years of the 16th century, and you can have a look on what became afterwards. That is, was a feudal palace. The fortress became a palace, and at the floor, at the ground floor, there were open shops. But look at the green, what happened added in green, because you can have a look on the columns that is still standing of the facade of the theater, but 5-6 meters higher. So the use of the building began 5-6 meters higher. So the shops are open in the arcades, in the upper part of the arcades. And what about here? We have seen a case, the Theatrus of Marcellus, where it was a fortress, but not all theaters of civil architecture became fortresses, and so they haven't been preserved. But some traces can still be seen. Look at this square, the famous Piazza Navone's most famous Baroque square in Rome. It has elongated shape with a rounded hand, and this was a circus. A circus in Roman time, you can have a drawing that can convey you the idea. And the idea is here is the beginning of the horse race, and here they had is a rounded end, and the rounded end is this one. And you can have a look on what became afterwards. It's the famous Piazza Navona with the rounded hand here. Here is the straight hand here, and excuse me. And you can see that the open space was preserved in medieval Rome as a marketplace, and what there is no more, there is the architecture, the Roman construction, but it's not lost, it's 5 meters behind, because some buildings have been built or built again, and so they discover it in their underground parts of the Roman walls. And here is another example. It's not in Rome, it's in Lucca, what an amphitheater can be as an amphitheater can be preserved, because Colosseum in Rome is preserved because it was in a part of a city totally abandoned. But where you have an amphitheater in a place where it's always been in life with people around, what is the final shape is the open space. The open space, you can keep it, and all the buildings that are meters built over the lost city, but they kept the shape. But my last example is what is the sort of the lost buildings. We have seen what is preserved, the entire building, Pantheon. What is preserved is the shape of the open space. And what are the last phases of the total destruction? Heap of ruins. And we have a look on the theater. Look at this aerial photo picture, and you can see in the grid of streets in the city there are some strange shapes. That is this one and this one. That doesn't fit with the other forms. And if you have a look here, you can recognize here the open space of the theater. Here was the round part of the where the people was sitting and looking at the show. So this is the sort of major ruins, and what I've presented you is what we can know from documents, written documents, and what we can know from pictures, from documents that are all pictures and written text from the 15th century onwards. But at the end of my presentation, I would like also to point to some other methods that probably you can use in Goa, in old Goa, and in Rome have been used. That is, when you begin an archaeological survey, you keep trace of all the strata, so that you can have the history not only of ancient Rome, but of all history. That is, you have these 5-6 meters, and these 5-6 meters you can take the materials that are inside as a sort of archive, a living archive of what happened. And this kind of investigation has been made for a part of the city that is next to what we have seen now. This is a minor theater, this one, with this portico, this one. And I can show here the drawings that have been made when this excavation was done, that is in the 80s, with these drawings trying to reconstruct what really happened. And for this part, at least, for only this part, the theater and the yard here, the portico, it's a scientific presentation because it's made on data from the digging. From the other part, it's partly hypothetical. So here is ancient Rome. You have a look on a temple and its courtyard. And here is the theater from Balbi. And the second image is this. Is the end of the empire, because the last century were difficult, there were political difficulties, so that it was very difficult to keep in order all the monuments. And you can have a look on the theater still working, but in bad condition. And you can have a look on the temple that are going to crumble. And first, I would like to also to point onto the high-rise building, because in Roman houses you always are presented of the domus, that is the mansion of the big owners, but people really lived in high and flats, in sort of flats in a high-rise building. And those high-rise buildings were unnecessary at the end of the empire, because the city was depopulated, and so all is lost. is going to be lost, so that the temple and the houses. And again, what we have a look here as a scientific representation all here, and the other part is hypothetical, as I told you. Thus, a city totally depopulated. You can see how the shape is lost of all minor parts, but what still in extant is the shape of major buildings, because it's very, very difficult to destroy a so big mass of architecture. And so here is the image around the worst of medieval times, and again is the final image that I would present to you a little time before the Renaissance of the city, when the seat of the Pope is again here. What is still easy to recognize here is the shape of the bigger structure, not of the temples, because the temples are made of parts, that is slabs or columns and all you can take and use in other buildings, in churches. But civil architecture, so big, so huge, tend to be maintained. So I would end this with a final image. We began with our horses and warriors, and we have seen them in front. Now I would like to present them from the rear part, because we discover here something interesting for us, that is an architect, maybe an artist at least, who is taking notes, who is taking a drawing of this rest of ancient Rome, and someone, look at the other one, who is pointing at really at the sculpture. But I would like to say also that this is pointing of something that we have to remember, that is this span of brick, this is sort of a wall. This is very important, because it's the trace of someone that did something to keep the horse on. Someone who made something poor with just a wall, but it signifies that an authority and interest in ancient Rome was kept all over the time I've showed you. So we have the main monuments that you can visit, but you can visit them because the 19th century restoration, okay, but also because in medieval times they had this history. Okay, thank you.
We can have maybe some question and answer before we move on to the next one.
Yes.
So, any more questions?
I've been to Italy and it's one of my favorite places, so it's really nice to have you here. The sensibility that is there within the society to value its past, where do you think it comes from?
I think it's, you had a very interesting question. That is, it's a long story, but in medieval times there was the seat of the Pope, and the Pope arrived and stayed with all his court from 1308. But previously there were the families, federal families, and federal families had their power because they had army, private armies, and they decided that the Roman post was theirs. That is, the church had this, as it was in the New Rome, the church at St. Peter's. The church is the estate of the church was a later story. But the first century, the Pope fled from Rome to France because it was sustained, protected by the King of France, because the federal families were too strong. And it is the federal families that decided that they were the heirs of Rome. And there is sort of dualism that continued along the modern Rome, that is modern till from the Renaissance till the 18th century modern Rome. Then after is another story. That is, they kept they decided that the capital, the ancient capital, was their place where to build their palace. So the palace of the capital palace was built over the ruins of the Jove, as you call in English, Jove. It's the main deity in Greek, in Zeus, not Zeus. Okay, the Zeus temple was on the capital, and the Roman feudal power decided to build the palace that represent Rome on the capital, so that there were the church there and the capital. So is the proudness. They decided that their statues were important, and there are some of the remains, not all. Not the buildings like the theater. There were fortress only there, but the columns on there, and there were a certain identity of the people of Rome, just in front of the identity of the church. So that as a sort of, they were proud of it. And this story is not only Rome, but the Roman past is something you can boast, or you can say, I'm the heir of the Roman, I'm not, my story is a long story, my city was centuries old, and so I keep all the monuments, I keep arches and walls, and all over the cities in Italy is the same story. That is sort of to be proud of. That's the way the major buildings arrive in. And some other things, like the famous statues, the Constantine not Marco Aurelio on his horse, is the only bronze bigger statues, is still extant because they believe it was Constantine, and so they believe it was a Christian hero, a saint. Because metal is very, very precious in medieval Rome, so bronze statues have been melted. So it's easy to keep marble statues, because they can use them to burn them to make mortar. You can use marble to make mortar, but not mortar. Lime, pardon, excuse me. You can use marble to burn marble to make lime, but metal statues are more precious, because you have no way to have metal, and metal, iron and bronze you use for forge the arms, for forge the, as you saw, all what is necessary to fight one against the other.
So status and class play a very big role also, obviously, in terms of giving
support. This bit about the federal families and that taking care. So it's the people themselves who feel identified with their past. That
the more privileged they are, the more is the sense of the connection. Yeah, Himanshu?
In fact, your presentation is very interesting. Also confirms for a lot of us the fact that historical buildings or cities are always in the process of being built, dismantled, falling apart, being reused, and this fact puts a question for us to the whole idea of conservation.
The whole idea of
architectural conservation.
Yes.
Where today we see the value of doing it, but at a theoretical level, it's the idea of preserving buildings as museum objects, digging them out and preserving it almost endlessly, right? It seems to go against the story that you have told, which is a certain established pattern in which cities move in history. So
generally, if we as a tourist, at least in Italy, what we look at is what the 19th century decided to preserve for us, and they built and overbuilt and make a presentation as a sort of, they wrote in 19th century, they wrote history, and they make our monuments. That when you are in Rome and visiting the Roman monuments, you are looking at them as Roman, but mainly they are an history of 19th century. It's not because it's not only because parts of them are restored, it's also because the levels have been, and all the arches, the honorary arches at the houses next them, and all the story has gone. Because in 19th century, from 18th century onwards, they decided that ancient times were important and medieval times were just a corruption of the ideal architecture, the ideal shape. So in 19th century, they gave the shape again. And what I showed at the end here is a different story. That is, now archaeologists don't decide that Roman times are better than medieval times, but they are layer by layer trying to understand the whole story. And you know very well that by digging you are destroying the strata, but you can leave some of them still standing. So here what I've presented at the end is a museum inside a building. It's difficult to have a picture of it because you don't have a Colosseum, another theater, but you have a story, the story of all the collapse or the story of all strata. Today, I think we as a culture, we don't accept to have the Roman times better than the medieval times. So we don't accept to have the perfect shape that is better than the shape as corrupted. And what they are doing now, but with monuments that have not been preserved like the others, because the biggest one have been restored in 19th century, so it's the end of the story. There are the monuments, the famous monuments, they are there. And the new monuments that are discovered under Rome, under the soil of Rome, they are kept as they are found. Because we, as culture now, the contemporary culture that doesn't decide with that today's that medieval times are best, or
if I may extend Himash's question, actually he's asking the whole attitude of when you are resource-starved and then there are more mouths to feed and all the priorities for yourself is so many. How is your perception of reusing the buildings or taking them forward rather than preserving them in the past? If I may, is that where you were going with it?
Yeah, my point really was at one point.
Doesn't it kind of conflict with it?
Yeah, the whole idea of conservation is put into question.
Yeah, why conserve? And I mean, how to conserve is one side of it, but it's like.
So what we are getting at, Susanna, from what we seem to be receiving from your story,
yes,
in many ways, is that there is also a lot of irreverence to the past, along with the desire to conserve. Both seem to exist in different ways, and as you rightly said, that it is a 19th century moment, a acute sense of what history is, where you harden the notion of what needs to be preserved. But what you seem to show through a much deeper historical investigation is that there is a tremendous arbitrariness in the way in which people relate to the past. This is familiar to us also, because here also we have a similar story, that the Archaeological Survey of India has produced a certain narrative about the past, and then classified the past in different categories. The whole idea of preserving or conserving it depends on resources, depends on political will, depends on what groups believe that these things should be preserved and not should be preserved. So there is a sense of continuity between both those places. But so is there any place for irreverence at all for the past? This is in a sense what Himanshu is asking. Is there therefore a relationship to the past which is not about conservation? Is there any other way we can look at the past without trying to? It's a very provocative point, but that is what is question.
But in ancient and in history.
Yeah, in history also, and maybe how do we learn about, how do we respond to that today?
the reference on
Irreverence.
yes, because I can reply with the hundreds of stories. There's in the long story of Rome, you have a fortress, and there is a famous story. You have the tomb of the Hadrian, the emperor. That is a round building, and was still extant in the 6th century. And 6th century was the army inside, and they throw statues and marbles against the enemies around. And so they used the marbles as, so that it is, they used it because they were in that situation. And I would also point on the fact that in the Renaissance Rome, they appreciated a lot the elder buildings. They studied them. They decided that modern architecture was to take the form of the ancient one, and in the meantime they destroyed enormous part of building, because in medieval times they were poor and they were few, and so they were killing each other. And in the Renaissance they were richer, and cardinal and bishops, and they built all their palaces, and they built their palaces with the marbles of ancient Rome. They destroyed more than before, and they were looking for the gold and medals and whatever. And so the big destruction is in the same time of the big appreciation. And this is it's complicated because, you know, it's a richness. Marble is a richness, and you can use in medieval times to burn, but you can also use to make your palaces more wonderful. And so best palaces of Rome are built on materials coming from what? From the civil architecture that were so huge, so big, and old bricks were very, very useful because were well with no humidity. Elder bricks are wonderful because you can cut them and you can use for modern buildings. And we have in documents hundreds of carriages of this kind of broken bricks from ancient monuments, so that a living city is always destroying the elder city. And only some monuments survive because there is an authority that says, no, there are some parts of ancient Rome, of our identity, that we have to keep on. We have to preserve the Colosseum, we have to preserve the honorary columns with saints on, not with the emperors, but with saints, because they are our identity. But the rest, the less famous, the more you are rich, more you destroy, there is consumption, more is like today. More we are rich, more we destroy our environment. And that's the story of ancient Rome, yes.
So much. So thanks so much. We could have gone on, but